The Hobbit is a source of unending mysteries for this series. Well, not exactly unending, but it's undoubtedly been my greatest source. Giants, Blood Orthin, Dorwinion. But this is a little different, for unlike the aforementioned topics, the one I'm covering in this video was not abandoned by Tolkien. In fact, they made their way into the Lord of the Rings too. In this video, we cover Beorn and the Beornings. Who were they, where did they come from, and where the hell did they get their powers from? Now, I'm going to give some background about the Beornings, but I want you to keep something in mind here. We're not exactly sure who is a Beorning and who isn't, and although we know roughly where they came from, we don't know how they got their exact origin. Now, men had been living in the Vales of Anduin since the First Age. They were firstly known as Northmen, but were later also given names such as the Men of the Vales of Anduin, or simply Woodmen. The exact differences between these peoples isn't known. In the 19th century of the Third Age, they were also joined by the Aethiod, the ancestors of the Rohirrim. It's possible that the Beornings, or the men who would become the Beornings, already lived in the Vales of Anduin at this time, and were known by a different name. Beorn himself didn't exist until the 30th century, so it doesn't make sense for them to be called the Beornings earlier than that. However, when we do meet Beorn in The Hobbit, he and Gandalf seem to suggest that Beorn, or perhaps his ancestors, had originally lived in the Misty Mountains and had been driven forth by the Orcs. This would imply that while the Beornings were almost certainly related to the other groups of Northmen, they might have developed as a separate group in the mountains. And just as a side note before I continue, Gandalf also says that some people speculate that Beorn was in fact a bear descended from the ancient bears who lived in the Misty Mountains before the giants showed up. There's a lot to take in that sentence. But this seems like a tall tale. In Letter 144, Tolkien confirms that Beorn was in fact a mortal man with this passage. Though a skin changer, and no doubt a bit of a magician, Beorn was a man. Keeping this in mind, we don't even know how many Beornings there were. We don't know if Beorn was the individual who started the whole group, a recluse who dwelt in the mountains, was driven forth, and then started his own chiefdom in the Vales. Alternatively, Beorn could have already belonged to a larger group of people who were driven forth, and he was simply the most prominent among them. His appearance in The Hobbit gives us mixed indications. On one hand, he clearly lives alone, but on the other, he seems to call together a meeting of bears, and unfortunately, it's unknown whether these bears are just regular bears or whether they are skin changers like Beorn. Even after the events of The Hobbit, we still don't know who exactly is considered a Beorning. After The Hobbit, Beorn becomes a great chief in the Vales of Anduin, and many of the local men submit to his authority, but it's unknown whether these men are other Beornings or whether they are Vale men or Woodmen simply looking for protection. When Tolkien mentions Beornings afterwards, we're unsure whether he's referring to all of Beorn's people, or simply those related to Beorn who also had the power of skin changing. In case you're wondering, while Beorn is dead by the War of the Ring, he did have many descendants. His son, Grimbeorn the Old, is chief during the War of the Ring. Under his leadership, the Beornings made sure the Carrock and the High Pass were open to travellers. Alright, I apologise if I've confused you, so I'm going to try and summarise everything we seem to know about the Beornings. The Beornings were Northmen who apparently lived in the Misty Mountains, but were driven out late in the Third Age. Their most prominent figure was Beorn, a large man who could shapeshift into a bear, and he became the de facto lord of the lands between the Gladden Fields and the Carrock, the Anduin and Mirkwood, after the events of The Hobbit. He ruled over the Beornings, a people that consisted of his own descendants and relatives who could also shapeshift, but may have also consisted of those who simply pledged their loyalty to him. By the War of the Ring, his son, Grimbeorn, still ruled those lands, and they played an important role in keeping travel possible from east to west. Okay, so now that we have an idea of who the Beornings actually are and where they might have come from, let's talk about the bear in the room. Their ability to shapeshift, or alternatively, skin change. Now, shapeshifting itself isn't exceptional. The Ainur could change forms as if they were clothes, unless they became fully incarnate. For example, Sauron was an infamous shapeshifter. He could look beautiful, he could look terrible, and he could take the form of a werewolf, a serpent, a vampire, and probably many others. and he would eventually lose this power. But what makes it unique when it comes to Beornings is that as far as we know, they were the only mortals able to shapeshift, with one exception, which I'll talk about shortly. Powerful elves such as Finrod and Luthien had the ability to cast illusion spells that could make someone appear different, but did not actually physically change the person, and the illusion could be seen through. The Beornings, however, would physically become bears when they shapeshifted, and had the ability to communicate with other animals. This obviously begs the question, where the hell did they get this power from? How did they learn something like this when powerful people such as the elves and the Númenóreans seemingly never did? Well, this goes back to that exception I mentioned before. Back in the First Age, during the third kinslaying at the Havens of Sirion, Elwing, the wife of Eärendil, and mother of Elrond and Elros, bore one of the Silmarils. To prevent it from falling into the hands of the sons of Feanor, she threw herself into the sea, with the intention of drowning and taking the Silmaril with her. However, Ulmo suddenly granted her the power to shapeshift into a white bird, and using her new form, she flew out to sea and found Eärendil aboard his ship. She would retain this power, and also had the ability to communicate with birds. Sounds familiar, right? So it seems very likely that someone taught Beorn or one of his ancestors, or simply granted them the power to shapeshift into bears. Regardless of the Elwing example, I think this is the most likely origin story anyway. It seems unlikely that the power of shapeshifting could be self-taught. So the question becomes, who taught Beorn or his ancestors? Well, it just so happens that there's a fellow that lives not too far away from Beorn who is a self-professed lover of animals, and is once referred to by Gandalf as a master of shapes and hues. And it also just so happens that we know Beorn has actually met this person several times, and actually likes him, which is rare. If you haven't worked it out yet, I'm referring to Radagast the Brown, one of the Istari, the wizards. He lives in Rhosgobel, not far to the south of Beorn's house, and like Beorn, he loves animals and can communicate with them. After all, he is an Istari in service of Yavanna. So yes, it's possible that Radagast taught the Beornings how to shapeshift. As a lover of animals, and as one of the Maya, Radagast would likely have the power and the will to bestow this ability upon someone. But why would he do this? I think there's a decent explanation here. Let's assume he taught Beorn directly. The lands are becoming more dangerous, and Radagast and the local men need an equalizer against the forces of darkness. And what better equalizer than gifting one of the local men the ability to shapeshift into a giant unstoppable bear? Perhaps there was a mutual agreement. Perhaps Beorn requested for the ability, and Radagast gave it to him as long as Beorn would take care of the local animals, which is something Beorn did. He lived with a wide variety of different animals, but he never harmed them, and lived entirely off dairy and honey. Is granting local men the ability to transform into ferocious giant bears a good idea? Well, you be the judge. It worked out well in this case, I guess. Radagast could definitely be helpful, but also comes across as naive, given how easily he falls for Saruman's deception multiple times. But before we get carried away here, I do want to say that this is a theory that is based entirely on circumstantial evidence. Radagast and Beorn lived near each other. Radagast and Beorn had met each other several times. Radagast probably had the ability to gift someone with the power of skin changing. Beorn had this power, and like Radagast, lived a peaceful coexistence with his animals. But none of this is direct evidence. Apart from stating that they had met, Tolkien never links Radagast and the Beornings outside of that. So even though it seems like a good explanation, it's far from confirmed, and should be treated as a fan theory. I also want to say that I did not come up with this theory. Considering the Tolkien community has been around for well over 70 years, I imagine it's pretty hard to come up with something that is entirely original. I'm sometimes able to do it in my other Middle-earth mystery videos when I'm covering stuff that's incredibly niche that no one's even thought about before, but the Beornings aren't exactly incredibly niche. My first exposure to this theory was on Lord of the Rings Online, where Radagast does teach the ancestors of Beorn the ability to shapeshift. In that game, there are also two other groups of men who can shapeshift after they captured a Beorning and tortured the secret out of him. The Garadyne, Wolfmen, and the rather disturbing Ungolidyne, Spider-Man. And no, not the superhero kind. I think it's a pretty solid theory, but I can't claim to be the genius who came up with it. My genius is limited to theories such as Tom Bombadil actually just being some forest bloke who is permanently high on shrooms and has somehow convinced everyone he's someone important through his bizarre antics, even though he's just constantly drugged out of his mind. So, it's possible the Beornings learned this ability somewhere else and from someone else. There are many spirits in Middle-earth who remained behind from more ancient times, and it's possible that the Beornings learned this magic from them. They would certainly not be the only men to have access to strange magic that other peoples couldn't explain. There is also the Druidine, who had the ability to animate the statues that they carved, and they could do this back in the First Age, long before Beorn existed. It's possible that while the Beornings were exceptional in the Westlands of Middle-earth, there might have been other groups of men across the world who had access to similar abilities. And to cap it off, you might be wondering, what happened to the Beornings? Well, the Beornings themselves were probably fine, but as magic continued to fade in Middle-earth, it's very likely that their gift began to gradually disappear. The Hobbit even hints at this, stating that Beorn's descendants were lesser in size and strength. Beorn's close descendants retained the ability, but perhaps 1,000 years into the Fourth Age, skin changes were rare, even though Beorn's bloodline now roamed far and wide. Eventually, the final skin changer would die, and no more descendants would have that power, and it would gradually fade into myth and legend, just like everything else. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I was thinking of ideas for Middle-earth mysteries, and while reviewing the playlist, I was actually kind of surprised that I hadn't done a video on the Beornings yet. After doing several videos on things like Bladorthin and Dorwinion and Khand, it was finally nice to do a video where I had a little bit more information to go off other than just a few obscure lines in the appendices. Anyways, cheers, farewell, and remember, you can be a shapeshifter too if you want, but you'll probably just be known as a furry.